By the end of this video, this little icon stands up all on its own. So before I get into updates for the lid of the fuel cell, I want to take care of some of the cable management. So what I want to happen is, the wires that this battery plugs into, I want them to route around the battery, up and over, and either out the top of the lid to resemble the fuel feed and return lines, or if there's not enough room between the body and this fuel cell, I want to sneak them out this back corner so they're kind of inconspicuous. Either way, I want to make sure the wires end up over here. So these two tubes that I'm gluing in are going to allow me to route the wires through and past the battery without any tangling. A quick update on the lid for the fuel cell. I swapped out the magnets for these styrene pegs. The pegs pass right through this plate and they're cemented in place. The magnets just weren't holding to the styrene, the glue just wouldn't hold them, and I didn't want them to break off later on. So now the pegs will just take care of the alignment for the lid, and I'll figure out how to make this magnetic a little ways down the road. But for now, the fun part, the important part, is working on some of the details for the top. So I'm going to build some fake straps and an access panel for the center. So you'll see coming up here in a few seconds, I'm using a metal washer in combination with a circle template to make sure I get a really good circle out of the styrene, and also take care of my measurements for all the holes I have to put in the access panel. Right now I'm just marking out center points and making sure the holes are all aligned and spaced out evenly. And you'll see after I trim off the excess with my styrene shears, I'll use the washer in combination with the rotary tool and almost use it like a router. This makes sure I don't trim off too much or have any misshapen circles. And with a little cleanup using a nail file, I end up with a pretty clean product after. After some adjustments to the lower straps, a few good coats of primer, and adding some scale hardware up top, I think it looks pretty cool. The fake portion of the straps look like they continue all the way around the fuel cell now. I'll spin it around a few times and give you guys a look. I want to stop here because I want to make sure when I build my floors that I have enough room for the plumbing, or actually the electrical leads, to come up out of here and pass up to the front of the truck without hitting or interfering with anything. If you remember from previous videos, I'm using the 16 scale mini rock crawler shocks from Losi. The rears, however, are a bit shorter, so I'm combining them with a pair of their short course or buggy shocks. And I'm using the shafts and a few other parts from those to make a shorter set. So I trimmed down the threaded housing from an MRC shock. Here's a clip of that happening. So after finding it and cleaning it up a bit, I end up with a short version of this adjustable shock body. Then I use the entire assembly out of the short course shock, and I end up with a shorter shaft. I swap over the larger lower link from the rock crawler shock and end up with something like this. I double check all the rubber seals. I take some RTV gasket maker and apply it to the threads. This portion of the assembly is plastic, so this will help ensure that when I do finally get these full of damper fluid, they won't leak, and it'll probably give it a bit of extra strength as well. So on the front coilovers, I'm using two of the heavier short course springs stacked on top of each other with a plastic retainer between them. The original springs don't have a lot of tension in them, so I'm not sure at this point whether or not they're strong enough to hold the truck up on their own. I'm thinking now that the housings and the shafts in the rear coilovers are shortened, the full-length crawler springs should be strong enough to do the job. Next, I tune them using a variety of internal springs. Up front, I'm using these long ones. Of course, once all this is figured out and I'm doing final assembly, I'll fill them with damper fluid, but there's just no use doing that and making a mess right now. Out back, I'm using these shorter ones, but I think I still have some trimming to do. The measurements seem to be slightly off, but we'll see when it's in the jig. So I took advantage. While the truck was apart, I sprayed the rear axle and some of the sway bar parts with black primer. I'm going to reassemble and add the bump stops that I built to the back end of the truck. So the back half is reassembled and it works. The fuel cell is now leveled. I had to build some rubber shims for this. It was sitting a little high in the front side, and I knew I had to build them. I just didn't know what size to make them until it found its final resting place. So I've now got that set up. I also created the bump stops for front and rear. They were really fun to make. A little bit of used parts, some Tales from the Parts Bin type stuff. These are Tamiya high lift antenna mounts, and they're just a threaded aluminum housing that a plastic antenna tube slides into. These are the bolts to hold on Tamiya high lift leaf springs. I've combined these two, and they slide into a piece of aluminum tube. They slide up into place in these frame mounts I soldered in. And in the top, threads in a scale hardware and a washer that keeps it from sliding down. And as you tighten it up, it actually expands inside here. So these will be epoxied into place later on, and also the pressure from the scale bolt will hold them in. Now these aren't functioning bump stops. They don't compress like the real thing, but you can see that once the suspension does fully compress, they will eventually make contact on the pads. The front axle also got a good coat of primer after rounding off the 3-link tabs and trimming off some edges. I also made bump stop pads, a new panhard bar. I trimmed down the axles so the worn scale hubs would screw on properly. I also added some scale hardware, so I'm going to get this back where it belongs and show you what goes with it. Of course, it's been a few minutes, but the front end is now back in the truck. You'll notice a few changes up front. First off, I have the one-piece springs back in. The internal ones I had actually had enough tension in them that they hold up the front end pretty well, so I moved back to the one-piece springs. They look better, they work better because they don't have the collar in between, and they look more like the ones in the real truck. I've also trimmed down the tube for the torsion bar, the reduced arms, and the linkage. I've got the new bump stops in, and while they're not glued in yet, I can show you that they will work, and these will reduce the travel in the front end the way they should. So those are pretty neat, and once I get them glued in, I think they will work quite well. Now I've cycled the front suspension through, and there's no binding issues, so moving forward, I think the only additions or modifications I'll have to make besides adding scale detail will be to change the pinion angle a bit. It's a little bit off, but I did leave the upper 3-link bar a bit longer, so there's room for adjustment in there. So I'll change that. I'll also probably move the lower link for the panhard bar to the front of this mount so it runs parallel with the steering linkage. Aside from that, I'm pretty happy with how this has come together so far. Vertically, everything's pretty well lined up. And I think once I get all the scale details on here, it's going to look quite good. I'm really excited to see it outside of the jig and sitting up on its own, so I'm going to toss on some wheels and tires. In just a few seconds, you should be seeing this for the first time as a rolling chassis. Well, it's a pretty big day with the scale icon. I know it is for me anyways. And I think we can now officially call this thing a roller. It's definitely been a long time coming. I think the only thing that would make this even better right now would be to drop the scale engine in place. So today's video is going to run a little bit longer. I'm going to do that next. So while I've got kind of some of the larger scale details figured out, most of that will be taken care of in future videos. I'll show you guys what's up with it though. Today's priority is to get the engine and transmission back in. So I thought I might as well install the electric motor in it so I can get a good idea of what the rolling chassis and driveline weighs and see if the front shocks will hold it up. So I'll get this assembled and get it bolted in the truck. So while this setup kind of looks pretty cool from the outside and pretty complex, it's actually just essentially a motor mount and a gear reduction. So the pinion gear gets mounted on the electric motor, gets bolted into the block, and then there's a gear reduction, and it's just a series of gears and shafts that step down through the transmission into the output shaft. So these aluminum pieces are what's left from the original valve covers and intake manifold from the RC four-wheel drive small block. I cut away everything I didn't need, and I'll be using these as a base to mount on my 3D printed parts, so then I have something that looks closer to the LS valve covers and also the intake manifold. This will make it so I can still bolt and unbolt these from the heads and the block if I need to. Now I know that the timing chain cover is completely inaccurate, but I'm using the harmonic balancer, crank pulley, accessory pulleys as a reference just so it gives me an idea how much room I have to work with between the block and where the radiator will be. They also look kind of cool on there while I build around them. I know I've been running on for a while, but I was so excited about the progress that I decided to add this all to one video. That way you guys could see most of the driveline in place. And with the scale engine in, especially with the electric motor installed, this thing sits pretty level. It's pretty close to what I was hoping for. If you guys want to see more photos of this, I'm still documenting this at the Scale Builders Guild in my build thread. If you guys want to follow me on Instagram, I'm at Supernatural Farmer. Thanks for watching.